All right, we welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is a show where we profile a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. In each episode of this show, we interview a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new definition of learning as conceptualized, narrated, and imagined by the guest on our show. Today's guest, Karishma Galani, is a dear friend. We've had the opportunity of working together for a considerable amount of time in Mumbai. Just to give you a little background about her work before we jump into this amazing conversation that I've been looking forward to for a really long time. So, Karishma Galani has spent the last decade in the education technology space with a master's in education from Harvard University, research at MIT's Media Lab, and time spent teaching coding and entrepreneurship at an international school. Her passion for education grows each day. Having founded two startups using artificial intelligence to enhance a child's learning, Karishma has traveled the world for her work, from Boston, San Francisco, Singapore, and Bombay. She now lives and works in London, UK, as COO of an edtech startup called Educai.io. Here she works to leverage AI to personalize the math tutoring experience for children. Before this, she also founded another startup called Paintbox, and hopefully she'll tell us more about that. And she also spent some time at Northeastern getting a Bachelor of Science degree in business administration. So there's a lot to unpack there, Karishma. You've had such an interesting life. And what I'd like to start off with, Karishma, is before all of this actually got started, what was Karishma like as a student growing up? What were some of the subjects you were most interested in? I know you went to a wonderful school where you had some amazing opportunities to learn and observe learning as well. And one thing about working in education too is most of us are also observers for such a long time. We are in the classroom watching our teachers growing up. So you have a lot of data to work with going into the education space. So, what was your experience growing up like, and what was Karishma like as a student?
Yeah, thanks so much, Abhishek, for having me, and I'm super excited to chat with you. Growing up, I loved learning. I was a good student, and I was very dedicated and hardworking, and I was always the student that asked the questions. Uh, it was a really enjoyable experience, I would say, but certain subjects were hard for me. I don't think I wasn't like a naturally gifted child. I do think I had to work really hard at all my subjects. And I think today I obviously love English and math. I've worked at two math companies at this point now. So clearly fell in love with it. And same goes for English. I've published a few books as well, and I love writing. But both actually took a great deal of effort and work that went into it, even growing up, right? So I wasn't always the strongest with literature and English, and had a really, really good teacher kind of open the gates for me on that. And, I think same thing for math. I had a really, really good math teacher who spent the time and the effort, walking me through the elements I needed to know. But I think for both of them, and it was hard for me, I think, at the time, but I think both of them emphasize the need for play and fun within those subjects. I think I was very, very serious about a lot of it. Like, what needs to be done? Let's try to understand frameworks and do it that way. But I think for both of them, they were actually ironically very laid back people, and had a very laid back approach. So I remember my English teacher actually would give us poems and stories that were very out there and very different, and would never say that there was a right or a wrong answer. I would leave it very open ended and allowed for that dialogue to happen. And I did fall in love, with stories and with math. And I think it was really annoying at the time. I remember being very annoyed about that. But I do think that we sometimes forget, even as an adult today, I sometimes forget that learning is about play. It's about taking the time to find the joy in what you're doing, right? And sometimes we forget that. I know I forgot that as a kid, so I've been reminded time and time again for that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Was there like a particular book, Karishma, that you remember reading that really caught your attention, or um, any particular
Yeah.
learning experience for that matter? Maybe a conference or a workshop that you did apart from things you did within the classroom that you remember?
That's interesting. I remember this poet called Szymborska. I still love her to this day. She's a Polish poet, and she was her poetry was so simple. It was something that that wasn't complex in terms of grammar or actual vocabulary. Right? It was always very understandable, very achievable. I was very surprised by that because I think up until then we were still talking about like Shakespeare and like very, very abstract thought processes. Of Mice of Men was another book. Again, kind of, I mean, easy read, but it's kind of like out there in terms of concepts. And I think with Szymborska, it was very relatable. The vocabulary wasn't complex, but the thoughts and ideas could be complex.
Mm,
Um, and I just remember my mind being blown when I realized that. I remember there were particular lessons where he'd be like, "What do you think that means?" And we'd kind of have a brainstorm, and at some point, someone would say something, and I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, yes, you're so right." I didn't even think of it that way, right? Like when words are capitalized in poems, you don't think they mean anything, right? Like how does someone communicate a thought to you? Is not something that I used to at least think about at that time. So I think I was always quite blown away by that. In terms of conferences, I mean, I did do a lot of MUN, don't know, yeah, Model United Nations. So there was a lot of debate that we did, and it was, I think it was quite, in hindsight, again, you can go very much by the book, but given the fact of today's climate, especially with the economics of it all, it's quite fascinating to think that at some point, like I remember I used to have to represent UNDP very at one of the conferences, and it was interesting because at that time you're kind of like, okay, what would UNDP say? And you'd read through the articles and try to figure it out. But in hindsight, that was kind of not maybe the right approach. Like it's so hard, right, for a 14 or a 15-year-old to think about that. But when you really think about it, it's about the having the analytical skills to be able to say, what would this kind of organization represent in terms of themes and ideas? And I think uh, that was probably what MUN gave me, at least, was that process of saying it's not about what's on paper, but it's more about the theme of it and how would you convey it. So there's a little bit of an art to the process of learning, right? And today obviously it's very different. Today I carry that with me everywhere because a yes or a no, even in a business deal today, for example, isn't something that you hold dearly, right? Understanding why is always so important. And I think that is what learning, paying attention to that concept and not just kind of did you do well in English and math and physics? It's not about the content, but more
mhm.
about the concepts and the themes, right?
Yeah,
So, yeah.
I mean, that's so insightful, Karishma, because you touched on so many topics that teachers and educators and people working in the education space really think about today, like learning through play or making learning relatable. And with the advent of the internet and everyone getting access to so much information, I think these are themes we're all trying to implement in our classrooms on a day-to-day basis. And the fact that you were able to observe that and also think about that at such a young age you know says something about what students are um, how students feel about the kind of learning experience they engage with even today, because um, teachers aren't the gatekeepers of information anymore, right? I think
Yeah.
students
Yeah.
often have access to all the information they need at a click of a button. So how do schools and institutions and change to adapt to those learning needs? I think that is a really crucial question for us to answer, especially with artificial intelligence and changing careers. I think both of us have worked in that space for a considerable amount of time, and we know that the jobs in the future are going to be so different. So I know you decided to study business administration at university. But Karishma, that decision of choosing a major at university, it's such a challenging question for a young person, and very often there's a lot of pressure to make the right decision when you are 17 or 18. So what was that experience like for you, and how is learning at university different from your experience learning at school?
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think I gave it that much thought. I came from a business family, and so for me, it was kind of an easy decision to do business. I think the challenge actually became, in hindsight, I'm not sure university right out of school was what I wanted to do. At the time, it seemed like a no-brainer, right? Like you go finish school and then you go to university. But I think I was so determined to work, to do something and to make impact, and I felt like that's what I was looking at, and so business just felt like the right thing at that time for myself, right? And so I actually went into this program that allowed you to do that, right? And so they have a co-op program that allowed me to go and work at a bank, as part of my university training and go through that process of what it would be like. Got very lucky in those experiences because I ended up meeting people who were very encouraging, right? So I think I ended up in corporate finance. I must have been like 19, and just ended up, and it's quite a boring job when you think about corporate finance. I mean, I was studying corporate finance in the classroom, and then I went in and did it in the real world. But it was one of those things where it's kind of boring, when you really think about it, because you're just going through documents, right? It's like accounting, but on steroids a little bit. Um, and I ended up meeting like a few really interesting people, who became mentors very quickly and wanted me to learn about the process, and
Mm.
were very open to asking questions, which again was still such a big part of my DNA. Even today, I am still the annoying person in the room that will ask all the questions because it's important to me. But they answered them, right? And I actually ended up really like, it was a great work environment, although I didn't end up sticking around corporate finance, but it ended up being one of those places where you learned so much in 6 months,
Mhm.
that you would never have learned in the classroom. And I think you can go back to the classroom and say, oh, now I understand where I messed up when I did this. But I felt like that experience of connecting the real world to the theory of it was very important to me, and it's still important to me, right? So even even something as like running a company, right? Trying to figure out what are the metrics that other people follow. It doesn't have to be that we do it, but let's figure out what happens outside and then let's bring it in. Let's read the books, when it comes to the theory of marketing, for example, and then let's figure out how we can fit it into us. It might have to be slightly more realized, but that's okay. We can do that, right? So quite a that to me was an important component, and that's why I chose and went where I went. That was very, very important to me. But because of that, the flip side of that was I felt like I have to. You are, and most of us in that program and in that process had to grow up probably much sooner than others, right? So I ended up going into banking right after, and got my first job at 19. I like started working at Merrill Lynch after that, and then went into Credit Suisse, which is another finance bank. And it was just like you're studying and you're being a student and you're trying to be a kid, be a teenager, but then you're also trying to figure out what all these other facets of life are, right? What a trading desk looks like. I remember I wasn't ever a trader, but I remember being fascinated by the trading floor. And I went in one day and just spent the entire day with a trader and trying to understand how they deal with it. It was so phenomenal to be able to do that. Now, today I probably couldn't walk into a trading room, but when you're 19, people are much more open to that, and open to showing you their day to day. And I think I seized all of those opportunities. And I'm very glad that I did because now I know I never want to be a trader. um, but I think that is so important. And so, it's great to go to sit in the classroom for 4 years and do that. I think there's so much nourishment in that as well. But trying to get that experience and understand what's going out in the real world is equally important, I think.
Yeah, that Yeah, and I feel like I relate to a lot of those themes, Karishma, because I feel like I went through
Yeah,
a similar experience myself, where personally I didn't feel like college was the right option for me right out of high school. And I realized that 1 year into university, and I think we've spoken about, me taking a
yeah,
gap year earlier too. But I think what's fascinating is that you spoke about that experience at Credit Suisse or Merrill Lynch, and I think university gives you a chance to be an apprentice in certain professions if you were doing a co-op program like the one you were involved in. And I think that is very different from the school experience in that sense, where not only are you studying something more specialized, you're also given the opportunity to speak to um, or understand what real world experts in that particular discipline do. And I
yeah,
think that is significantly different, because slowly you are able to make more connections between what you are learning in the classroom and what
yeah.
how that knowledge is applied in the real world, because suddenly how language and math become a more specialized discipline, in terms of it becoming finance or business or literature. And you suddenly start thinking, how is this knowledge going to be useful in the real world? And I think different fields go about answering that question in different ways, but it's surely something students think about at that time. And something I've been pondering about, Karishma, which I also wanted to understand your thinking on this, is the opportunity of reskilling
Mhm.
for professionals mid-career. Like, do, do you think we're still going to be in a world where people choose something at university and then they have to be in that profession for the rest of their lives? Or do you feel like edtech platforms will give professionals opportunities to not only reskill, but possibly also move or jump into a completely different profession in their mid 20s or mid 30s, depending on opportunities available? So what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's here to stay. Not gonna lie. I mean, I know I've hired a team in the two previous startups I founded, and both of them we did not. I mean, obviously, the university you go to is something that obviously we looked at, but I think the first ever intern we had was hired on the basis of a few nano degrees he'd gotten off of online courses for coding. So I think that actually is here to stay, is what I've noticed. And quite frankly, even today, I would look at that a little bit more, right? Especially in these skills of machine learning. And I don't know if you've heard of some of the newer technologies like GPT-3 or NLP. Like these are so new, right? They're so brand new that it's almost not possible yet for people to have actual degrees around them, right? It is all about people trying to go out and figure it out. That is the best way to do it. And so I actually think that the more time that will go by, the more we will see that stuff coming out. And it may not even be online courses or reskilling, it may just be self taught, right?
Mm,
A lot of coders are coming in, and this is again more on the technical side, not to say that it doesn't exist in other fields as well. But like, just for example, with crypto, right? Everyone's still trying to figure it out. Yeah, there are courses, yes, there are avenues, but it's so brand new that we're all kind of in it. Even if you were to get a degree in it, it doesn't say too much. Right, it's a credential obviously that you can hold on to, but I don't think that at least as an employer at this point, I actually, and in being an employer previously as well, I've actually started giving that slightly less weightage myself. So I think it's here to stay. But I might be biased because I'm hiring and looking at tech talent. But same thing goes for product. I've seen that product is such a. I mean, it's been around for a while, but it's still quite a newly popular field to jump into. And there's so many, like General Assembly. There's so many outlets that you can learn about product management that don't have to do with a university degree per se. So I think it's here to stay for sure, Abhishek.
yep.
And by the way, so is apprenticeships. I know we published a book about this like years ago, but I do think it's making a comeback. One of the UK, I think it's UK or European, Multiverse. It's a tech company that is looking at apprenticeships, and like it's just become a unicorn. And so, I mean, that's not to say anything, but it shows that there's popularity in a space that maybe is an alternative pathway to success, right? And education, right? Hopefully. Because not, I don't know, schools and universities, I mean, they work for some, but not for everyone. And we know that now. And so it's nice to see some of these other avenues coming about.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned, a couple of examples of other pathways people can also take up. And it's interesting that you mentioned, your perspective as someone that hires talent. I know it may be a little easier in technology, with people being able to work remotely, and that is something we see with a lot of people looking at additional courses that people take up related to programming or design, and using those courses as a credential for hiring them. But I think you mentioned something. You mentioned the nano degree, and you spoke about. I know there are other things like micro credentials that people are looking
Yeah.
at. People are looking at online degrees where they complete their entire degree online, and I think you can also do shorter courses. And I know platforms like Masterclass are looking at experts and bringing them online and bringing all their knowledge online. And it's like Khan Academy, for instance, also
Yeah.
does a wonderful job working with younger students. And I feel like what's happening here is this tinkering with the first principles of education and learning. Because if you think, and I feel like this is where I want us, to sort of challenge our thinking a little with how we look at education in the first place. For a long time, we've generally looked at schools as institutions where students would study from kindergarten to grade 12, and then
Yeah.
you'd move into university for 4 years and then do a master's degree and then possibly a PhD, right? And I feel like, edtech is pushing these institutions to tinker with their basic structure, because at the end of the day, I think the objective over there is for people to acquire skills and knowledge. But there's also additional objectives of social development, and bridging the equity gap in a lot of developing countries, and even in the developed world. I think you have the same problems across different contexts. But how do you think, like, reflecting on your own experience, like, what were some um, alternate pathways that you took up that you feel gave you the same experience you may have gotten from a more formal institution? And
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, yeah, just to touch upon your previous point, by the way, which I thought was quite fascinating, because yeah, you have micro credentials, you have the nano degrees, you have badges that even, for example, at Educai, we ask kids to take a about a 30-minute long behavioral and academic assessment. And it's mainly meant for, anywhere from 8 years old up to 12 years old, right? Like that's the age range we're looking at. And they take this assessment that isn't trying to get to the fact of how well do you know math, but it's like, how do you approach your learning? Like, are you confident? Are you a quick learner? Can you recognize patterns or not? Where do you sit when it comes to resilience and grit? And do you rush through your work? Like that's the stuff that we're trying to monitor now. And at the end of it, they get a profile, right? A learning profile. And in that, you're either it will be 1 out of 10 different learning profiles that we've kind of come up with, but within it we've actually implemented badges, and that's a system to say not that you have to improve on X, Y, and Z, but that if you are a lateral thinker, that's a pro. Let's give you a badge for that, and then let's talk about how you need to work a little bit harder on the pattern recognition, and here are some tips to do that, right? Very different approach than what you and I are, definitely what I was used to growing up, right? It was either you got an A, B, C, or D, and here are all the things that were wrong on the test, right? There was no assessment of whether or not you could get better, right? I had teachers who did that eventually, but when it came to the system, that's just not how the system worked, right? So today I want to bring up the fact that entrepreneurship has become massive. And I know you and I were both there when we were working with high school students trying to talk about social entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship. But I would say 2013, even that was slightly early. Today, when you look at an alternate pathway, if you will, you are seeing companies like YC, or even the one that I partook in, which is called Entrepreneur First, that provides kind of that framework to build a company of your own. Now, none of this, just because you end up building a company doesn't mean it has to go well or not, right? Building a company teaches you a whole bunch of skills. Even when you don't actually go ahead and do it, you're learning a lot through that process. And I think if you look at YC, for example, they've come up with something called Startup School. Anybody in the world can sign up to this. It's free content and they walk you through how to do it. I know multiple high school students who are just so obsessed with it that will go and watch the videos and do all of the stuff, right? Because they give you like marketing tips and here's how you can grow your direct to consumer brand. And kids will try it, they'll play around with it. It doesn't mean that they will start a company at the end of it, but they've acquired such important skills that today, like, I see multiple teams struggling with, right? Like the influencer economy and all of that. Like people are struggling with that. Crypto, like 18-year-olds are better at doing that because they have access to the content to be able to do so. So I think a lot of times the question comes up as to, okay, is it even that necessary to go to university immediately if I already have that knowledge and if I can already apply it in specific places? Now, I do think that what university gives you is two things, right? It's time, essentially, to figure out what you like and what you don't like, a structure, and some sort of credential at the end. I'm not sure that the signaler of a university is going away in the next 5 to 10 years, but definitely in the next 20 years, I think that it will be one out of many signalers, right? And that's the place where we want to get to, right? Because some kids do really well in university and others just, you hear about the 21-year-old that owns a massive company. Like, imagine the amount he must have learned and the skills that he must have developed through that process, right? Um, so I actually think that there already are multiple avenues. They just aren't that big yet, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I feel like that is something that, we, and because I'm a teacher in the classroom, that's something I constantly think about, the fact that, um, my kids are going to enter a world where there are going to be multiple, signalers, as you said, and
Yeah.
I want them to start thinking in that direction too, is that, they have so many different career options available for them, but also so many different pathways to move towards those career options. And, you know
But it's
very
so hard, Abhishek. Like, to be able to, I think the biggest barrier in a child's brain, I mean, it's not even about the pathways that are there or not, but it's just this weird barrier of, if I'm not good at school, then I'm not good at life. And I think that's the emphasis that gets thrown out, right? I see kids coming into, we also tutor, right? So we're a math platform, but we also physically have an agency and tutor kids. So kids come in all the time, and just because you aren't great at math doesn't mean you're not great at other things, right? You might need a little bit of help in specific areas, but there are other places that, and I think that's what we try to do. And I'm so glad that I can work with kids again, right? Because I think that's a component that I really missed from our time together. But it, it's one of those things where it's less about the content, but more about the trait of confidence, for example, right? Building a child's confidence at that age between 10 to 15, I would say is much more important than building their skills in math or reading or anything else. Level of confidence in yourself and knowing that you'll be able to figure it out, being having to improve in one area does not make you um, unsuccessful, right? Um,
Yep.
so
and
yeah,
and I
I think
think
it's a
we
big.
No, but I completely agree, Krishman. I feel like technology can really help us, address some of these challenges, because even in my class, very often, there will be like in grade five, I teach grade five, and sometimes children will get so bogged down by writing the
Yeah,
perfect narrative essay or the perfect descriptive essay. And then I think, I think what you do really well, Karishma, is the systems thinking approach, where you are able to look at things from a macro perspective. And what I tried doing, at least towards the end of the year with some of my kids, and this is just to be reflective about, my experience in the classroom as well, is I started talking about what the language arts curriculum here in North America can basically be broken down into. So, most of the language arts curriculum is basically four areas of skills, which is reading, writing, oral communication, and media literacy. Similarly,
Yeah,
math is just five areas, at least till grade eight. It's number sense, algebra, spatial sense, data management, and financial literacy. So in my hand, I can break down what both these subjects are all about. And if I start telling these kids this, I mean, I
yeah,
started explicitly telling them this is what you need to get to. Now, there are different pathways to actually get there. Now, reading. Tell me what do you think is the best way to develop your reading skills? And there was this kid that was amazingly interested in dinosaurs. So he read a ton of books on dinosaurs, and there's so much information. I mean, I did not have all those books in my classroom. So
yeah,
I sent him to this directory that had like information about 300 different dinosaurs, and for some reason he thought I created that resource, which I just linked him to. And in that way, I think technology and the teacher in the classroom worked,
yeah,
sort of hand in hand to support that student. And I feel like, I was reading up on Paintbox as well. I feel like in with that particular startup, when you were working there, you were working more on the teacher side because you were helping teachers design tests using, a couple of basic inputs that they would, put into the system. Because I got a chance to also
yeah,
look at that
yeah.
product, which I think is amazing because you're helping teachers do better in the classroom. And with Educai, you're also helping students. So I feel like you have this lens of both these startups. But Karishma, I know after your banking experience, you spent some time in an international school, and that's the school I think you were also part of growing up. And I want to backtrack a little bit and think about how that phase in your life was sort of an incubation ground for some of these ideas, you've come up with today related to education. Like, what did you see in education in India, which I think is where you worked at that point of time, that inspired you to want to solve these problems?
Hmm. That is a great question. No, you're absolutely right. I spent 3 years there, right? That's where you and I met, and it was everything. And I remember when I entered, and even till today, I tell people this all the time, right? Like, even till today, nothing in education surprises me anymore, or in edtech surprises me anymore. I think education is a little bit of a push, but let's be specific. Edtech surprises me anymore because of my 3 years there, right? We spent so long delving into various problems, right? We went from mobile learning to coding to social entrepreneurship to figuring out how to like make a 3D printer work, all in 2013, right? Which was kind of like a lifetime ago, but also like very, very early in this technological journey of edtech. I mean, we were in edtech before it was called edtech. And I think that's important. But I wasn't really thinking at the time, at that time I left banking and I had spent so long wanting to be there. And so when I was kind of done with it, it was a little bit of a shock. And so working at the school was just meant to be like a very temporary thing until I totally fell in love with it. I mean, obviously a great team. But then more than that, it was doing something and watching it make impact somewhere, right? And I remember when I was teaching high school kids social entrepreneurship, I think one of them wrote it in their college essays. And then, I think he also wanted to be a banker. And I think after the course, came up and told me that, he may not be one at the end of university. And I was just so thrilled to hear that because I was like, yes, I'm glad that, it's just opened up a world, right? And I think that's what I really enjoyed. It was just opening up a new world to kids who maybe didn't have that ability yet to see all of it, right? Because in school we always have a system, right? We all live in a system, and I think that's what worked so well about the role that at least I was in, and so were you, right? R&D, research and development. We were lucky enough to be part of the system, but sit side by side along it, and innovate and bring that into the system, right? We had a very specific framework and a way to do that, and I think it allowed not just our team and me specifically to flourish and learn and grow, but I think also the kids that we worked with. I remember one kid who, built a automatic trash can for India, right? So that it automatically shut and send an SMS to the government to come pick up the trash because that was a massive issue in India. And that kid may have continued on to go and study finance and do all of his things, but that experience is something that I think he holds on to, and I think I still receive messages about it every once in a while. So I think that's the kind of impact that made me want to continue staying in ed tech and education, right? It was something that was tangible, something that made a difference, right, to the next generation. And so, yeah, it built the foundation. And even till today, there are certain issues that will come up, and I will go back to that experience and figure out how we solved it or how we navigated it or what we would have done. But I think that's what working in a school gives you, right? You do have to deal with a lot of issues and a lot of systemic barriers essentially to change, right? Resistance to change is so high in a school that even the best of schools struggle with it. They're meant to, because they're meant to block out change because of the gentle nature of which you are, incubating a whole bunch of kids. And so it's important for that, but because of it, I think we're at the forefront of trying to figure out how to make change happen. And startups is all about that. And so I attribute all of my entire career to those 3 years at that school and learning about edtech, and most importantly, falling in love with it. Right. So
Yeah, and we were lucky to work with some great people, Dr. Shabi Luthra, Scott Hoffman, who I think we just were so lucky to be exposed to their experience and exposure at that point of time in our careers, and I feel like that set us up really well. I mean, all of us took different. Many of us, still working in the same institution. Some of us have gone to different parts of the world, but I feel like I completely agree that working within the system also gave us that opportunity to not only tinker with the system but also understand the value of the system in the first place, and there are benefits for that framework and structure of being in that kind of institution. And I think some of the things you mentioned, sometimes I think kids just need a safe space to be. Sometimes it's not
yeah.
always about learning, or sometimes. And I think even university, I think it's important for kids to have a safe space to learn different things and discover their identity in the process of learning those different things. And I feel like that's also one of the other additional purposes of education, that we are trying to understand better on a day-to-day basis. But you decided to do your master's in education at one of the best universities in the world, Harvard. What was that experience like for you, Karishma? And what did you see? Why is Harvard one of the best universities in the world according to you? Based on your experience there.
um I think, and maybe this is controversial, but like I do think that the university is only as good as what you take out of it or what you put in it, I guess is a better way of putting it. But any university you go to, any access to knowledge uh, is a positive one, right? I saw it as, and I struggled with the decision of whether I should, take that or continue working, and it was a tough time and a tough decision to make. But at, at the time, I mean, I think I viewed it as an investment in myself. And in my future, and I think that's, and time for myself, quite frankly, and doing things that I loved and figuring out what I wanted to do, and spending time in the classroom to reflect on all of the actions that we had done in school, to figure out what was the theory behind it. Because remember, I had never studied education. My background was in finance. So part of it was also to get that credential, like you say, right? And so I loved it, but I think um, the most thing that I loved about it was the connection to time, and the connection to the people in education, right? So I took a course with Howard Gardner, and that was something that was really, really something that I had spent many, many years trying to, read his books and follow up on his research. And the fact that I was able to do that was something I never took for granted, right? And I think it required me to spend time in the real world trying to implement some of those things, to then go back to the drawing board and into his classroom and try to figure out what that meant, right? And I think that's what it was for me. The other thing was MIT's Media Lab, right? So being able to spend time at Lifelong Kindergarten, which is a research group at the Media Lab, was something that I had spent many, many years like looking into, and we'd visited them for a conference because of our work. And so it was phenomenal for me to go back and be able to work there and participate in that, right? And so I think those were my big takeaways from it. It was an important time for me for sure, because it gave me that. I had this massive foundation with working in a school, and then it gave me that understanding of why certain things were working and why they weren't working, and having that support from an educational community was something that I realized I needed. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. But it wasn't easy, right? So I was working at like three different research labs, trying to implement like three different strategies, and a lot of that research, I think, like you rightly pointed out, even at the school, you are kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, right? In many ways, and just trying to learn about. Like I remember one of my professors, Chris Didi, he spent like 50 years in the research for VR in education.
Wow.
So yeah, and it's just phenomenal, right? Like we put on these glasses and we debate whether or not VR will work in the classroom or not. This guy has been at it for 50 years. And like been talking about it, and has believed in it for basically most of his life. And I think that to me is quite phenomenal, to have that sort of grit and persistence, in such a niche subject and area, was something that I really greatly appreciated. So even Sesame Street, right? Sesame Street does a massive collaboration with the education school at Harvard, which is something I never knew. And it makes total sense that Sesame Street would do so well in the US, because and over the world, but because they are based in education and in real world, right? So I think that was really phenomenal to see how that works.
Yeah, I think that must have been an amazing experience for you as well, right, Karishma? I think just being in the company of all these great thinkers in education, Howard Gardner, I mean, for the listeners that are not familiar, was the person that spoke about the theory of multiple intelligences, and his research has been quite influential in academic and in practical settings. And I think you have some great professors there, but I'm sure you also met peers that were thinking about some of the same problems or some of the same issues that you were passionate about. And I think there's a lot to say about learning from peers as well in a
Yeah,
university setting. But one thing the viewers, I'd like the viewers to also know, is Karishma is a published author. She's published two wonderful books, Maker Minds and Making a Shift: Social Entrepreneurship in Schools. I consider Karishma one of my mentors, and I've learned so much from her. And the Social Entrepreneurship Summit that she was part of was something I also got the chance to work on. And I think both social entrepreneurship, design thinking, these are great skills for students to acquire. But another thing I know Karishma is really passionate about is the edtech space, especially in India, but also around the world. And I think you're someone that's very knowledgeable about developments in this sector. For a teacher, and I know a lot of my listeners are also parents and students, Karishma, like for someone that doesn't know anything about the edtech space, I know you're coming out with a publication soon related to education technology. So, can you give us like a brief intro or like a macro insight about what edtech is and where you think it's going? I did read your amazing article on Lightbox Ventures where you've presented some mind-boggling statistics about the growth of the edtech sector in India. So I know it's the last 10 minutes. I want to be respectful of time, but I just want to get your thoughts on the edtech space in India to start off with.
Attack in India. It has been tumultuous, especially now. If you switch on the news, it's very different from even just a few weeks ago, right? So things have been up and down. But attack, I think, is here to stay, right? I think back in the day there was a huge debate whether or not learning will happen online, and today it's just that's obviously the way forward. Right, even though it doesn't, there are quirks to work out, but given the pandemic, we've just seen a huge uplift with edtech. And also, I don't know how much folks are viewing the news about this, but this is something very interesting to check out. So China and India were the largest edtech markets in the world, right? Just given by population, but also by sheer fact that they're developing countries and they are they view education very similarly, right? They view it as a cycle breaker, as a ticket to a better life. Which many people have very famously said that the two cycle breakers are education and technology. And so when you combine them, they're just very powerful, right? So China had one of the largest edtech unicorns back in 2020 called VIP Kid, which was basically teaching Chinese kids English in a slightly American accent, taught by American teachers, essentially. And the American teachers were making a side business, essentially, out of it. 2020 happened, pandemic happened. Almost every Chinese edtech company started doing well. Same thing with India. But then what happened in China is that a massive rule came about sometime, I think, in 2021, if not late 2020. And that rule basically said that you could not, as an edtech company, you could not profit, particularly on the edtech space, too highly within a certain threshold, and you
Oh,
couldn't charge higher than a specific amount. And what that did is overnight basically kill like half the valuation in most of these companies. And
wow.
so that was one thing for China, which was massive, right? It had repercussions across the board because many American investors and European investors had invested in China, attack specifically. But what it also did for India was everybody now looked at India because India has a slightly more stable economy, if you will, and government, if you will. We're very much a democracy. And our edtech population is also very similar to China, and we view education very similarly. And so overnight, India has now gained a lot of attention from all over the world. And so you have companies like Baiju's that are doing extremely well, and Upgrad, and all of these are reskilling, right? They're all teaching online. Upgrad is obviously for university kids. You have Unacademy, which is kind of like Skillshare. So you've got these various players, and there's some questionable activity happening around it. There's the ethics is big. That's something that we as India need to monitor, especially with ed tech. How much do we care about the ethics when it comes to education, and the business of education, right? And so I think there's a lot to think about. But in that article that I wrote about, we were talking about Imbibe, which I think they had already sold to Reliance at this point. And what Imbibe was doing was leveraging AI to basically understand how a child can go from not being so great at specific exams and then kind of creating that adaptive path to creating success and increasing metrics like 33% in just one particular subject area, right? And so in the like the main JEE exams, right, in India. And so it's quite phenomenal to see that you have certain players that are trying to push the morality and trying to say education is everyone's right. We need to provide education, and therefore there need to be more parameters around it. And then other sides where you have companies who are just in it for the business. Because keep in mind, India is still one of the places where, regardless of socioeconomic background, people are still spending about a third of their income on education, which doesn't happen in Europe, right? In a lot of European countries, such as Germany, for example, a lot of education is public. A lot of it is taken subsidized by the government, and so the pocket there that you can play with as an edtech company is much lower than a country like India, where a lot of it has to be paid out of pocket. So I think that's why India is viewed as such a massive place for growth, because they're investing so highly in education.
Oh, yeah. And I know in the article as well, Karishma, I think, what you shared was so insightful. But you also mentioned that there could be about, I think this was in 2018 when you published the article, there were around 300 million students That so in that number, how many do you think would have access to internet and the opportunities of online education according to you? And it doesn't. I mean, what's your best guess estimate in terms of numbers?
I would say that I read a few studies. Like obviously, internet infrastructure needs a little bit of work, but in India, you're looking at the 1 billion population that requires like access to internet is much. But the smart mobile penetration has changed the game a little bit, right? So if I take Imbib's example, they actually put all of that. Reliance obviously bought them out, but all of that content is on phone, so
Hmm,
they are mobile first, right? And so that allows for higher penetration. There's also, I mean, you see this in ad tech in India as well and other startups where there's a huge focus on not just Hindi, right? Hindi only like 10% of India speak,
sure.
right? There are other languages. And so can you imagine what that means for education? Like most of our education is consumed only in English or in Hindi, right? But there
Hmm,
are multiple others, hundreds of languages in India. And so the need to translate is super, super high in edtech, which is something that, a few edtechs are looking at to change, right? But yeah, I don't have a number for you, Abhishek, but I do know that even though kids are, and this comes out from either the same article or the same genre, but you are looking at kids who aren't necessarily, who even though they complete the degree in engineering, for example, they are, I think, like 85% of them are not uh, job ready yet. So even though they do go and give the interviews, they aren't getting the jobs because they just are not qualified, even after having a degree, right? So India is one of those places where the college world doesn't necessarily, and the credential doesn't necessarily act as a strong enough signaler, right? It's still easier for you to, which is why I think micro credentialing may actually be a better thing for
hmm.
India because the skills is necessary. Getting the piece of paper is equally necessary and difficult, but unfortunately, those institutions are not doing a great job at preparing the kids, right? So 85%, I mean, that's a crazy number,
It
right? To
is.
not. So yeah.
Yeah. And,
India is it's it will come out as a strong player in that tech. But right now, I mean, if you open the news, it is having its tough time, right? And that's primarily due to ethics
hmm,
around that tech. So I do think that I don't think we could come up with a rule like China did, which, by the way, also ethics was massive, right? I think that's why they came out with it, but we can't do that as a democracy. But there does need to be slight more regulation around it and how we, certain companies are pushing loans on families to be able to buy some of their online degrees and families that cannot afford those degrees, right?
hmm.
So I think that's where the ethics comes in, and how much you manage that will determine the future of edtech in India.
Yeah, and so much food for thought there, Krishma. And I hope, you provide us that thought leadership in terms of, just writing about some of these issues. And, even as a teacher that's really passionate about education, I was not aware about, some of these issues that you mentioned. So I'm really looking forward to that publication whenever it does come out. And for the listeners, I will be linking the websites and Karishma's online profiles on LinkedIn. So do reach out to her if you are a teacher, an investor, a parent to understand how you can use Educai, which is an amazing tool in case you're interested in math tutoring. And Karishma can give you more information about that. And, do follow her and understand. I mean, I think there's so much to unpack. It's hard to do it in a 1 hour long conversation, Karishma, but I
Yeah.
wanted to thank you so much. Just to end the conversation, Karishma, I know, and to change things a little bit, I know running is something you're really passionate about. What are some of the other things Karishma likes doing in her free time, just to give the listeners, a glimpse of your world beyond education.
I mean, no, I do spend a lot of time on education and
Yeah,
edtech. I would say that's about 80% of my life. But yeah, I do love running, and I continue to do that in the parks in London. I've recently gotten into rock climbing,
yeah.
which has been phenomenal. And then right now, trying to learn a little bit more about direct to consumer marketing, which is very out there, but I'm quite fascinated with how people get their product out there in a very, I would say in a very step by step way, right? Very, very organic. I think it's sort of the way you do it, Abhishek, to be honest. Like start slow and grow your audience and do the things that you love. And I've seen you do this for so long. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to learn about right now.
That's amazing. And one of the reasons I remember when we used to work together, you told me about the benefits of running, and I just picked it up recently, Karishma. Like I
Oh,
try to
you
do it.
did? Oh, I love
uh,
it.
I'm trying to run a little more, and I think running is a great metaphor for life as well, right? In terms of how it teaches you how to manage your energy, but also set smaller goals to reach like larger goals. And yeah, thank you for that, Karishma, and thank you for your time today. I know it's a busy schedule for you, but I think this would be a really important conversation to not only understand. I mean, for listeners to understand how you designed and went about, different decisions in your career, and sort of a visual archive of your thinking at this point of time, but also for people that want to understand how your thinking evolved to get to where it is today. So I hope it was a step in the right direction for you,
Yeah,
Karishma.
no, it was so lovely to chat, Abhishek, and I've been watching your channel for a while, so I feel very privileged to be part of it. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Perfect. And for the listeners, stay tuned for more such episodes of Learning Stories. And we have some exciting interviews lined up. And please do follow Karishma on the social media handles that I will link in the show notes. And until then, keep learning.